Like Professor White said earlier, I think that this is, I am a student of Begins. I recently graduated this fall. I'm like one of the first graduating classes, I believe, so that's really exciting. And now I'm doing my master's here at NIPSIA, which is the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs, focusing on conflict studies. And my initial impetus, I think, for sort of looking at this specific research topic was sort of the way that I often see in my own life and my own organizing in my own communities, this intrinsic link between two things that seem so deeply connected to me, but how very, I would say, vacant the academia was in terms of looking at these two topics. So the way that we often think about resistance or the way we think about participation in activist movements, I think is so linked to art at a very community level, but the academia has very little to say about that. So what initially I would say, similar, I think, to a lot of people, I always start with very big research questions and very big goals. I think that I'm really, really lucky to have Professor White as my advisor because he's able to scale down my very, very large goals, I think, to much more reasonable research goals. So I initially wanted to look at a lot of different research movements globally, and then I ended up scaling back to looking specifically at Black Lives Matter in the United States, and looking at the way that specifically the role of emotions, fear and anger, not only allow people to mobilize in terms of participating in these movements, but in terms of the actual production of art themselves. And I think that fear and anger is particularly important. So when we look at self-efficacy and why people choose to participate, so like what brings someone out to, say, the ballot box, or what brings someone out to a protest. The research says that, say, for instance, that fear is the thing that stops people from doing that. When people are afraid within their societies, and when people are constantly paralyzed by fear, they don't participate as much. But anger comes from a belief that your society is supposed to do something for you, that you have the ability to make changes, and that your political actions are ultimately going to result in changes. But what I think is incredibly interesting and incredibly unifying about the role of art within these artistic movements is that you can create art that is incredibly powerful and incredibly moving, even when you're terrified, even when you think that that you're very afraid for your life, or that you think that your society isn't going to respond to your political needs. You're still able to create art that can then galvanize a movement, and that can then respond to people's anger, and you can create change in that way. And I think that was the ultimate end goal of what I saw in my research, and I was incredibly excited about that. In terms of methodology and skill building, I'm sure a lot of the people in this room have been through the ethics, I would say, process, and it's been incredibly interesting and I think illuminating to me in terms of all of the work that you really have to go to in order to even get to the point of, say, interviews. So I think that I focus largely on a literature review and sort of creating links between parts of academia that oftentimes aren't linked. So for instance, looking at political science, and then linking that to say art literature, which is oftentimes not intersecting very much. Similarly, looking at psychology, looking at the way people respond to social trauma and the way that people's emotions ultimately aren't often considered when we think about their political participation. And I sort of connecting all of those ideas together to sort of create two ideas of bottom-up processing in terms of creating art, and also top-down processes, and how those two things can be equally effective in terms of motivating people. I think that moving forward, I'm really excited to continue this research, which is not something that I expected to continue after the summer, but luckily I have a master's program and lots of research papers that I will be able to write, and so I want to continue to look into this specifically in terms of getting firsthand accounts about participation, and then also moving forward into not only having firsthand accounts, but also empirical data to back up participation, because as we were saying earlier, I think that literature is great and academia is great, but I think it means nothing if we can't apply it to real world processes and the way that people interact with their world. I think I'm over my time now, so I'll just say thank you. I think this was an incredible experience. I think it was also amazing to be able to just delve into research about something that you're passionate about. It's not very often that you get to do that in university, especially over 4 years where you're trying to build your skills and learn the basics. And so this was an incredible experience, especially at the end of my degree, to be able to do. And I think all of these skills will be really, really valuable moving forward. Thank you.